Alright, so this has been in the news lately, and to be honest, I have actually considered this topic long before the current media frenzy, and therefore I've put some non-emotional thought into the topic, and the idea of Canada being a state, a single state, is absurd. Now, this video is not my opinion as to whether or not this would be a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just adding some additional thoughts and some context that I haven't seen anybody else bring up so far. So, setting aside any other legal tomfoolery, precedent, or any other existing laws or geopolitical reasoning as to why these two countries should not be wed, here's how I think it would more or less have to go down. Now, I don't think Canada could ever function as a single state. There are too many different ideas and cultures within Canada itself. And while each state in the United States has a lot more autonomy within the system that it exists in than the provinces do, the provinces still have some leeway in their own laws that being all rounded up together in one state would just completely negate. For example, how each province chooses to distribute alcohol and marijuana, as well as the provincial tax rate. For example, in Alberta, there actually is no provincial tax rate. And that's not even including the massive language separation that exists in a huge chunk of the country. Now, setting politics aside, centuries of immigration from across Europe into Canada has resulted in very distinct cultures and ideologies across the country, just like in the States. And that's not even including the influx of new immigrants into Canada that they've received over the past 10 or 20 years. I'm going to open up Microsoft Cave Paint and show you what I'm talking about. Now, everybody knows about the very obvious English-French divide across Canada, right about here. That's existed for a very long time. But in the early days, a lot of immigrants came in from the East Coast. A lot of them are Scottish and Irish. So Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the rest of the East Coast has a lot of Scottish and Irish people in it. A couple centuries later, Canada built the railway across the country. And they used a lot of Chinese workers to do it. And when the Chinese workers were done the railway, they retired where they finished, which was on the west coast. A lot of Scots on the east, a lot of Chinese on the west. In the 30s, when Stalin was going apeshit and killing everybody, a lot of Ukrainians fled. And the Canadian government actually offered them free land in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta, because it was, very similar geography and farming conditions to where they were from. On top of that, we've got a subsect of French people that live outside of Quebec called the Acadians. They settled somewhere on the east coast in this area. And a lot of them actually got run out way hundreds of years ago. And they fled to Louisiana. And Acadian got anglicized to Cajun. But there are still a lot of them in the east coast there. And they're not quite Quebecois. They've definitely diverged from that culture. On top of that, there is a group called the Métis, who have been around for hundreds of years, and they are just all over the place. They've got their own flag and everything, and they are half native, half French, and as I said, they've been here for ages. So that's just historical immigration patterns. Now, we add modern cultural dispersions on top of that, and out here on Vancouver Island, we've got crystal-loving, mushroom-headed hippies who love to meditate. And just on the other here, and then just on the other side of the mountains is all mostly oil field workers and cowboys. Even northern and southern Ontario are kind of different beasts altogether. Now, all of this is just to say that trying to fit all of these people under one banner as strict as statehood would be a total clusterfuck. Even more of a clusterfuck than the People's Republic of Kazakhstan already is. Some of the gun laws that should and need to be implemented in some of the high crime, high population cities, right, down like Toronto and Winnipeg, those gun laws would not work in Nunavut and the Yukon, where they have to deal with like 2,000-pound killing machines on a daily basis. You need to have different laws in these places in order to serve the people who live there. So, there would need to be some sort of division in order for everybody to get what they want. And the addition of new states, and therefore new senators and new congressmen, needs to be fair to the already existing states. There exists something called the equal footing doctrine, which says that states coming into the Union exist on an equal footing to the states that are already in the Union. It's kind of a state balance, and there is no seniority. And this has caused problems in the past in regards to states joining the Union. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, two very distinct sentiments arose around slavery: the anti-slavery movement in the North and the pro-slavery movement in the South. Now, states obviously get to make their own laws independently of each other. However, each state has representatives in Congress and representatives in the Senate, and therefore they're able to sway each state is able to sway federal laws, and they can sway them in their favor. So come 1821, there just so happens to be 12 slave states and 12 free states. So in order to maintain a balance and cohesiveness, they come up with the Missouri Compromise, which you can look up on your own time, but it basically means that from this point onward, any states admitted into the Union would be admitted in pairs, one slave state and one free state, in order to maintain a balance of ideologies and just kind of a cohesiveness. This was until California shows up and fucks everything up. So I think similar discretion would be paramount if Canada were to join the Union, because if you don't maintain that balance and you start doing whatever you want, that's how you get a civil war. So that's kind of my thesis statement. That's my main point, is that Canada, I don't think, can be one state. I think it must be many. Now, obviously, slavery would not be the hot topic at hand, but I do think that there is a very clear ideological divide between left-wing and right-wing ideologies in the West, and I have some ideas as to how these divisions might go. Keep in mind, I am not the most qualified person to be making these choices. I've never lived in most of the places that I'm talking about. However, the idea has to start somewhere, and do with it what you will. Alrighty, let's head on over to cave paint again. First off, Quebec's out. They don't want to be a part of Canada. They never have, and they've been nothing but a thorn in the side of English-speaking Canada pretty much since its creation. Quebec separatism is a whole other topic. You can look it up, but like FLQ crisis, America, you don't want that smoke. Just let them go. People who hate America can go to Canada and join the original Canadians and speak the language of New France. Coeur de Bois. Samuel de Champlain, motherfucker. But yeah, you never corner an injured bear. That's when it mauls you. And that's when you end up dead, right? Let them leave, or else they're just going to burn your society down, right? So, Quebec's out. Now, Newfoundland over here. I think Newfoundland's going to have to be its own state. Newfoundland was its own republic before it joined Canada, and god damn it, I think they would be willing to do it again. A lot of people say that Alberta is the Texas of Canada. I disagree. I think it's the Newfies over here. Now, Newfoundland is also paired up with Labrador. Now, I've never been to Labrador in my life, but I did meet a guy from Labrador once and went to school with him, and I asked him about this topic for this video. And he said that Labrador was constantly getting taken advantage of by Newfoundland and that they would absolutely want to fight for their own statehood. There might be some complications to that. I don't know if that could be a thing. But I mean, like, goddamn Delaware's a state. And that thing's freaking tiny. So, maybe. But there's some complications to that I will bring up later. So, Canada's got 3 maritime provinces. We got New Scotland over here, Nova Scotia. We got Prince Edward Island. And we got New Brunswick. Now, I think we'd be able to group those all up into one state. They have similar heritage. They've got similar economies and stuff like that. So, I think you'd be able to group them up pretty well. You may have to put them in one state with Newfoundland, which the Newfies would only go for if they got the capital. But I'll kind of get to that later. Now, Ontario here is kind of two different worlds. Southern Ontario is a big gender ideology center in Canada. It's where Jordan Peterson got his claim to fame in the universities there. And Northern Ontario is the boonies. It's the land of hunters once you kind of get away from the Great Lakes a little bit. So I think you need to partition that kind of somewhere in this area, with the bottom half of Ontario becoming its own thing, and the top half of Ontario joining the first 2 prairie states here, which I think you could keep along their existing borders conveniently. And hopey hope, there's one prairie state. Moving on. Now the next prairie state, I think, would, again, require some partitioning, because British Columbia like California, is a land of split ideologies where all of the gender-bendy loonies in the cities in the south of the province make all of the laws and dictate the lives of the people in the rest of the province, which are absolutely nothing like them. And this is already kind of a problem in British Columbia right now, and I think the issue would just be transferred on and kicked down the road if we kept British Columbia as is. So I think you'd need to split it. Obviously, I can tell you right off the top, Vancouver Island, and Haida Gwaii up here, the second chain of islands, they're definitely going on one side and becoming Northern Oregon, right? And then the line would be drawn, maybe somewhere kind of along this line, giving all states, new states, water access. If you give Prince Rupert to this prairie state and then this kind of becomes Northern Oregon, I don't know. The line's kind of flexible. One thing that I do know is that I would not trust the Great Bear Rainforest here to be protected by the business tycoons on the other side. The gender-bender loonies and the hippies might be a little crazy and delusional, but they have their place in society, and I think that they would do a very good job at protecting those environmentally sensitive areas. Another interesting idea was to where to draw that line would be maybe the watershed, where the water flows into the ocean. It's on one side, and where the water flows onto the prairies, it's considered on the other side. That would keep one state from pissing upriver of the other state. I'm looking at you, Alberta, with your toxic tailing ponds. And then we move on up north to the 3 Canadian territories here. Now, I think it just makes the most sense to keep them as American territories as well. There's no legal law requiring a certain population for statehood, but it's been generally accepted and kind of respected as 60,000 people being the requirement for statehood, and none of those have that requirement. On top of that, I think that 6 new states is probably enough of a culture shock at once, and maybe the territories could be reassessed at a later time. But as is, none of it's only been a territory since maybe like 1991 or something like that. So I think for ease of access, these 3 can stay as territories. And there we go. That breakdown would give us 1, 2, 3 states of one ideology, and 1, 2, 3 states of another ideology. And that's where Labrador here becoming its own state gets a little dicey, because that would kind of mix up the balance. And, I'm sure that there's other social, economic, political reasons that I've overlooked that might blow holes in my little theory here, especially when you look at the election maps for the past 4 years in Canada. But I think that this is a much better idea than the blanket 51st state idea that is being proposed at the moment. So, in the words of Danielle Smith, we're your best friends, America. Let's make a deal.